Okay, I want to talk today about a video Beau, the fifth column, Justin King, made about what the Irish Republicans think about Palestine. Because apparently a lot of his audience are really shocked that, contrary to the natural correct position, the Irish support Palestine. What can that possibly be about? Why would the Irish, who are notoriously left-wing, support Palestine? It's shocking, apparently. So, I just want to say, I'm not going to go through every video. There's too many of them, and they're not all that interesting. But this one is particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. And not just this one. I think it's worth also prefacing here that Justin King himself has said that he is of Irish descent. I don't know how much that matters to him, considering what he says about Irish sentiment on the situation. I'm not convinced that I think a lot of Irish people would not want to claim him, got to be honest with you, considering what he says about it here. So, let's just begin with here, shall we?
Okay, I watched your recap video with the questions at the end. You talked about how the Irish and Irish Americans have an interest in, quote, the conflict. That was surprising to me.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he does kind of always choose messages that will give him the words that he wants to use. So he always keeps saying the conflict, right? It's not a conflict, it's an occupation and a genocide, but he doesn't want to use those words.
I have to admit, I wanted to know which side they were on. I know that sounds horrible. When I read about it, I began to understand less. It seems like in the beginning, they supported us and were our friends. But somewhere it changed and they supported the Palestinians. What I was reading said this was because the Irish became leftist. I think I learned from you that they were always leftists. I'm just wondering if you could tell me what happened.
Okay, so he kind of says things like our friends, because obviously the Irish would be with us, right? Us people who support Israel, clearly they're nice, progressive people who are on our side. And he's also using that one because he's saying our side, like from his perspective, this is our side, and he wants the viewers to think of it as our side being with Israel, okay? And I sort of love the way that this guy who gets sent the message was saying, I know it sounds horrible, but I want to know which side the Irish are on. Yeah, because it's like that kind of makes it very clear that there could be consequences to this for how you think about Irish people. And I'd sort of I find this quite interesting because the way that he talks about this, he does do pretty good explainer on it. As you would expect, actually, to be fair. Let's just start off with this little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, Irish Republicans are nothing like American Republicans. And this goes back to, look at 1916, the GPO, the post office. Look at the proclamation. That's not a right-wing document. So from the beginning, when this topic came up, the Irish movement was already left. Okay, so that's definitely not the change.
Now, I'm kind of interested by the way he says the Irish movement. Doesn't say the Irish Republican movement. He doesn't say the Irish independence movement. Doesn't say anything about an uprising against British colonial rule. He does sort of mention it a little bit later, but so he's kind of, obviously in the USA, Republicans are considered to be right-wing, and so, the word's been a bit messed around with over the years. So obviously Irish Republicans have a tendency to being left-wing, and he's had to explain that.
The source you were reading probably didn't want to acknowledge what caused the change, because it's really, really simple. In the beginning, the Irish were incredibly supportive of the idea of a homeland for Jewish people. Why? Because they saw parallels. They could identify with it. They were a people who wanted their homeland as well. So they saw this connection. And it didn't end there. There's also the massive migration. There's a whole bunch of things that drew parallels.
So he's very much, now I didn't actually know that, by the way. I didn't know that they supported Israel to start with, and it kind of makes sense from what he's talking about. I'm guessing that's true until I'm told otherwise. But I think what's interesting here is that he is always framing it in terms of Irish only think about this in terms of their own experience, right? They're not thinking about it in a logical, objective way, is what he's always telling you here.
Ireland changed over time. Ireland became a country, but not all of it. It was partitioned. It was partitioned.
Yeah, and he doesn't quite go into, doesn't say at all really about how awful that was, how things were at that time, and he doesn't really go much into the subsequent events, really.
When Israel became Israel, what happened? A partition showed up in Israel. At that point, the Irish no longer identified with the Israelis. They started to view the Israelis as more like the British because of the partition. At that point, sentiment started to grow for the Palestinian side, and that sentiment still exists today.
Okay, so I think it's quite like he keeps talking about sentiment. Like, obviously there is sentiment there, but it's not just about sentiment. It's not just about how they're just identifying with them because of their own difficult history. That history leads them to understand the nature of colonial oppression, okay? And he really skates over that. He doesn't make it clear that, he doesn't want to acknowledge that really Israel is a colonial oppressor. I mean, he says that that's how they see it. He doesn't really want to acknowledge that that's actually what it is. Okay, so I'll skate over a bit more, I think. And then here. So he's done a bit of explainer.
When I read about it, I began to understand less. It seems like in the beginning they supported us and were our friends. Countries don't have friends.
So he basically repeated that message and sort of explained that. Now, I think it's quite interesting how he said countries don't have friends, as though this is simply the Irish government, and the Irish government speaks for the will of the Irish people. And, right, to an extent, yes, the Republic of Ireland's government are more or less siding with Palestine, okay? They're not that great on it, but they are more or less, okay? But it's, they're still not the same as the Irish people, okay? They're not the same as the Irish people who live in Ireland. A lot of them will feel a lot more strongly about it than the government, and there will be, I don't know, there's probably going to be people who are pro-Israel, and then, that he's also not talking about the Irish diaspora, which is huge, actually. It's often said that the Irish's biggest export was its people. I don't know, but it's quite possible there are more Irish people living outside of Ireland than in Ireland. And so they're not a country, okay? You know, the Irish are in America, the Irish Republicans in America aren't the government of Ireland any more than Jews living in America or in the US, in the USA or in the UK are with the government of Israel. It's not like that, but he keeps trying to go back to this whole thing of the people are their country, the people are their government. He keeps going back to that.
They have interests. It changes. That's where it comes from. That's why the coverage elicits such a response. And that was the basis of the question over on the other channel, was why is there so much reaction in the United States to this conflict?
So this is leading into the next thing I'm really keen to talk about, because he's really downplaying why people feel the way that they do, or trying to find reasons why people feel the way they do that aren't, or focusing on particular reasons to the exclusion of others. Okay.
And that goes to two things. One, if any conflict was covered the way this one gets covered, showing the footage that is shown, it would elicit a reaction.
Now, that's fair, actually. In the past, it's not been possible to cover conflicts the way this is being covered, and there are other genocides going on at the moment. There's one in the Congo, I think, and there's one in so there's been a bunch of hundreds of thousands, I think, of Armenians displaced in Azerbaijan. There's been expulsion of about 3 million Afghanis from Pakistan into Afghanistan. So there's still stuff going on, and obviously the Rohingya are still stuck in Bangladesh after being expelled from Myanmar, that kind of thing. So this is still going on, and yes, to be fair, there hasn't been as much coverage of those, and historically there hasn't been, because it's just not been as easy. Everybody's got a smartphone now, even in the poorest countries, loads of people have smartphones. It's just very common. So to be fair, that is true, okay? And we're not seeing that much coverage of these other genocides that are going on at the moment. There are some, but it's not the same.
At the same time, news outlets aren't incentivized to provide coverage like that of every conflict, because they don't have built-in groups in the United States who care about it. They don't care about the other conflicts, the same way.
So, to an extent, that's probably true. But, okay, so not every African American is going to be from the Congo. There are going to be plenty who are, but they won't know it. But that doesn't mean they won't have an interest in it, because they're black, and quite often they do see the black struggle as a universal struggle, in many ways. So you'd think the black population would be concerned there, and then you've got the Afghanis being expelled from Pakistan, like I said, and then the Armenians being expelled from Azerbaijan, and that's a big Muslim one, okay? So they've got quite a large Muslim population, but apparently these things aren't of interest to them.
In the United States, obviously, Jewish Americans, they have an interest in what happens. Arab Americans have an interest in what happens. So do Irish Americans. So it has a built-in audience. And so people in news agencies who decide on coverage, they know that this will be viewed because there's a built-in audience. When that coverage is provided, other people who don't have a vested interest, they see the coverage and they also have a reaction.
Now, it's quite interesting here. He doesn't talk about what the reaction is, for a start. He's not talking about the fact there's loads of protests. Millions of people around the USA have been protesting about this. And, the Jewish Americans with an interest, many of them are protesting against this, okay? Many of them are protesting against genocide in Gaza. He's not mentioning that. He's not saying which side any of these people are on necessarily. He's just assuming that you'll accept that, you know, basically all Jews in America are on the side of Israel, probably, and that all Arabs in the USA are on the side of Palestine. And I find this whole, and it's also really skating over the fact that the US is heavily involved in this. You know, you can, and people do know this. You know, you go, like, I like to go and look at Joe Biden's Instagram accounts in the comments, and you know, so just yesterday you've had every day there's comments saying along the lines of calling him Genocide Joe. It's just flooded with stuff about how he's funding a genocide. I don't want to be funding genocide. No, I'm not doing Black Friday. I'm not funding genocide. You know, there are many, it is flooded with these comments. People know what the American interest is in here, okay? So we don't see the, you know, and in the UK, this is why we're having such a big reaction too, okay? Because we know in the UK that our government isn't just complicit, it's actively enabling this genocide in Gaza, and we're not happy about it. And but he's really avoiding that, and they know it in the USA too. So yeah, he's just completely avoiding talking about that. And it's a disgrace. It's disgusting how he just completely avoids that. And like, there's a video, I'm not going to look at it because it wasn't actually that interesting, but it was, and that was part of the point really, when there was the $14 billion of aid, or was it 48 billion? I think it was 14 billion, of aid was approved for Israel. The only video he made talking about that was the GOP apparently trying to pull some wheeze about getting, I don't know, the aid being funded by, like, I don't know, gutting healthcare or changing some tax allowance or other, okay? And he was basically saying, like, his comment on this $14 billion of aid that is going to the USA was not, you know, what that aid is doing. It's not that it's funding genocide. It's not that it's funding weapons. It's not that it's funding the Israeli genocidal project at all. It was, haha, look at these silly GOP people thinking they can pull some wheeze like this. That was his commentary. Because he doesn't want you to think about it. He doesn't want you to think about the horror. He doesn't want you to think about the US government's involvement in the horror. He's really doing his best. And he's been framing this as, like, he's been framing this as, like, the natural progressive position is to be pro-Israel, which is not the case. It has never been the case. You know, I have been boycotting Israeli products since, like, 1999, okay? And every left-winger I've hung around with has been, you know, I went to Woodcraft Folk, which is like nice middle-class professionals, and they would talk about boycotting Israel. You know, it's a very common thing to be pro-Palestine and, you know, not to become, at the very least, even if you're not like me and think the state of Israel shouldn't exist, to be against, you know, the way that the Israelis treat the Palestinians among the left. It's very common. But he's been trying to frame it as not like that, as like it being somehow progressive to support Israel. And that's disgusting. And that's what he's been up to. This is what he's been leading to. He's been trying to take people into right-wing positions by convincing them that it's a left-wing position to be on the right, essentially. And then the Irish sentiment. He's really framing the Irish sentiment on the issue as being about their personal gut reactions and got nothing to do with the fact that their history means that they understand, okay? It means that they understand what's going on better than the average person, say, in the USA would, okay? It's not about gut reaction, okay? Some of it is. And there's nothing wrong with gut reactions as well. There is nothing wrong with being emotional about a genocide, about a horrific genocide, about Gaza being, all the buildings in Gaza being pretty much destroyed. So many, over 20,000 people being killed now, and I think something like 8,000 of them children. There is nothing wrong with being emotional about that. Nobody should be ashamed or made to feel ashamed of being emotional about that, okay? You just shouldn't. And this whole thing, he just continues this framing of people being at one with their country, even if they don't live there. It's wrong. This is not, his idea is to try and get us to think in geopolitical terms from the US perspective, basically, and think of ourselves as as separate, somehow observing, but also our investment should be in the side of the USA. I just find him so disgusting. It's just awful. I really hate it. I hate that he's in this position and that he's able to push this. And I'm arguing with people in r/BreadTube, which is supposed to be a socialist forum, who are literally trying to tell me that no, it's not the natural thing to be for progressives to be on the side of Palestine. He's got these people really brainwashed, essentially. It's awful. So there you go.